Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 35, and today I'm here with Paula Pant talking about financial independence. Paula escaped her 9-to-5 cubicle life, traveled the world, and started a self-employed career. She lived on half her income, invested the other half into index funds and rental properties, and became a millionaire by age 31. She's now the voice behind the successful podcast, Afford Anything. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. A big thank you to our new patrons, Mikkel Kolf and Heather Lyon. Thank you for aligning your money with your values and joining the Sage Family Patreon community, where you now get to enjoy perks like a monthly live Q&A where I answer all of your burning questions, and access to all of the experts who join me here on the show by hearing your questions posed in the Q&A segment. Are you supporting the work you believe in through Patreon? For as little as $1 a month, you can do your part to create the world you want to live in by supporting the people doing the work that makes a difference. Feed what you want to see grow at patreon.com/sagefamily. And a special thank you to Mary Jane 917, who left a review in iTunes saying, "Your podcast is my self-care. When I get time for me, I turn on your podcast, and I learn so much to help me and my family on our parenting and unschooling journey. It always makes me feel safe about my choices for our family and excited to continue our journey. I'm so thankful for all the knowledge you impart and always stoked when I have already done something you've recommended, or I at least know what you're talking about. I love the whole flow of the podcast, and I recommend it a ton in my local homeschool group. Great, great work." Thank you so much for the kind words, Mary Jane 917, and to the other 128 people who have reviewed the podcast and are responsible for our 5-star rating. This adventure of the week was a week-long visit from my niece and nephew. In addition to all the sweet fun times we had here at home, full of meals on the deck, card games around the table, virtual reality gaming, and Nerf wars in the yard, we explored Deception Pass, where we hiked all around the trails that take in the stunning views. Mount Rainier, where, much to my niece's delight, we saw a bear in addition to all the waterfalls. Fort Casey on Whidbey Island, where we played around the abandoned military base and lighthouse. And nearby lakes, where we swam with friends. My husband even took my nephew, who just graduated high school, into work with him, where he got a behind-the-scenes look at what his career is like, and then they spent the rest of the day exploring downtown together. A week later, Sky's good friend came by train to stay with us for a few days, and they enjoyed all kinds of teen fun, including a lake party, a sleepover, the mall, and an indoor trampoline park. Perhaps this can serve as a reminder that as your teens reach for independent adventures, find the yes. I'm grateful the parents of these teens I've been enjoying recently did, and I know the kids are too. If you want to see photos and videos of this adventure, then head on over to Sage Parenting on Instagram and follow along. Today, Paula Pant is joining me to share a conversation on financial independence. I found Paula's podcast, Afford Anything, when it was recommended to me by a friend who knew I was wading through the debt freedom movement and on into financial independence. Her message of "you can afford anything but not everything" really resonated with me, and her smart yet smooth ability to make complex financial issues more digestible has been really helpful. Plus, my son Bay says her voice sounds like a fairy tale narrator, and I have to affectionately agree. So tell us your story, Paula.
Oh, that is the most wonderful compliment. Now I feel all this pressure to make sure that I really do live up to this fairy tale narration voice. Once upon a time.
Oh, my son's going to be so excited when he listens back to this. So tell me your story. Like, what is your relationship with financial independence? What are you passionate about? What's your life like? How'd you get to where you are now? We start with a very simple and specific question here on the Sage Family Podcast.
Extremely simple and specific.
So simple.
Yeah, I figured you might ask, like, what's 17 plus 9?
Tell me everything about who you are and why you are that way.
All right. All right. Let's do it. So I will take this story all the way back to when I was in college, which I'm 35, so that was a while ago. But back when I was in college, I really wanted to study abroad.
Cue dreamy flashback music.
Exactly. Oh, this goes so well with the fairy tale motif. I very, very strongly wanted to study abroad, but the study abroad programs were prohibitively expensive. They were between $15,000 to $20,000 for a single semester, and that was just outside of what I thought that I could pay.
Yeah.
And so I thought about it, and I realized I didn't actually want to study. I just wanted to go abroad. And so I realized that if I graduate, work for a few years, save up some money, and then go off and travel, then I'll have the abroad experience at a fraction of the price. And so that's exactly what I did. I graduated from college in 2005 and went to work at a newspaper. I was a newspaper reporter for 3 years. My starting salary was $21,000, and my ending salary at the time that I quit was $31,000. So it is not a stretch to say that I was not well paid. And bear in mind, that's in like 2005 through 2008 dollars. Like, this isn't 1972 dollars that we're talking about. And so during those 3 years that I was at the newspaper, I started freelancing. So during the evenings and the weekends, whenever I wasn't at my day job, I wrote freelance articles for magazines and for websites. And every single penny of my freelance income after taxes, I saved into a travel fund. And so after 3 years, I'd saved $25,000.
Nice.
And so once I had that $25,000 saved up, I was like, woo! On average, this is a year's worth of my income. It was huge. And so I quit my job and bought a one-way plane ticket to Cairo, Egypt, and spent the next 2 years backpacking around the world, primarily spending time in countries where the dollar exchange rate really worked in my favor. That was a big part of how I was able to do that. And when I came back to the U.S. in 2010, I did not want to go back to a traditional 9-to-5 role. It seemed too stifling. It seemed too rigid. I wanted, once I'd had a taste of that freedom, that autonomy, the ability to wake up and decide exactly what you're going to do with your day. Once I had a taste of that, it was pretty addictive. And so because I had been freelancing during the years in which I was at my day job, I effectively started freelancing in 2005 or 2006. I realized that I could take this part-time side hustle and scale it up into something full-time. And so that's exactly what I did. I scaled up my freelance work that I'd already been doing from part-time to full-time. And it was while doing that I knew that being a freelancer, I was going to be subject to a lot of income volatility. I mean, that's the nature of the beast when you're self-employed. And so I wanted to build a safety net so that I could smooth out some of that income volatility, and so that I could take bigger entrepreneurial risks. And so I started very aggressively saving and investing. And I invested money into a variety of different types of investments, including 401k, a solo 401k, which is what self-employed people have, as well as an HSA, which is a health savings account, as well as rental properties. And that seems to get an outsized, disproportionate share of attention when it comes to my story. But really, it was just one of many slices of the pie in terms of how I invested.
Right.
So I invested money in all of those various ways. And by the time, and somewhere along the way, I also got married. My soon to be ex husband and I are in the process of splitting up. But
Congratulations.
thank you. And so by the time that I was 31, my our net worth topped $1 million. We hit the double comma club, as I like to call it.
I like
And then by the
that.
time I turned 34, my net worth as a single individual um, hit the post $1 million mark. So
Nice.
I think it's around 1.3 or something like that today. Uh, and so essentially what happened was that as a result of consistently saving and investing, I was able to build enough of a portfolio that I know that I could, at a minimum, if I wanted to, I could pay my basic bills from the passive income that that portfolio generates.
Mm.
I'm not talking about a luxury lifestyle, but with 1.3 million in assets, I mean that's enough that I could reasonably draw down around 40 grand a year, a little more than that, and if I wanted to. And 40 grand a year is um, given that I have the flexibility to live in low cost of living areas, is more than enough to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. And, again, I'm not talking about necessarily a lavish lifestyle, but it's enough that I have a safety net. It's essentially enough that I know that if I were to take some type of an entrepreneurial risk in which, um, my income tanks for 3 months or 6 months, I can give myself that type of uh, you know, unpaid job situation
Right.
because I at least have this safety net underneath me. And that to me is what financial independence is. Financial independence is the point, I define it as the point at which your passive income, typically through investments, is enough. And that leads to the philosophical question of how much is enough. But,
Because you can
I
afford anything but not everything.
exactly.
Yes, and that's perfect because my next question was like, what is FIRE or financial independence? And your story illustrates it perfectly. It's living in a way that sort of in the first phase, you are channeling your funds into investments, and then you hit that financial independence or FIRE date or point where the passive income that draws from those investments is enough to sustain your lifestyle. Is that accurate?
Yes, although lifestyle is kind of a fungible term. Like lifestyle is one of those things that, um, you know, could go up or down in
Mm-hmm.
weeks or months. And you often see this happen, like when people lose their jobs, or if you have a two-income household that decides to become a one-income household because one parent decides to stay at home with the kids for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
People's lifestyles are dynamic. And so I would hesitate to peg financial independence to your current lifestyle, given the fact that if you imagine your life as a graph, your current lifestyle is one random data point in this big, giant graph of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than pegging financial independence to essentially a randomized data point of how much you currently spend, I would tie it to um, what's the least amount that I need in order to live a like decent human life for myself
Right.
and my family, and that's what within the financial independence community, it's what we call lean fi. um,
Mm-hmm.
and lean fi or lean fire is, you know again, it's not living fat, but
Right.
it's what is the least amount that I need in order to know that I'll be okay? Because once you hit this point at which you know that you'll be okay, you might not be going to restaurants, you might not be taking vacations to Hawaii, but you at least know that you'll be okay. There's a huge level of psychological freedom that comes from that, because that's when you can start making those decisions from a place of opportunity rather than fear.
Mm.
And so that's when, to go back to the example of let's say that you want one parent to stay at home. And when you hit lean FI, that becomes so much more feasible because you know that you'll be okay. You might have to sacrifice the restaurants, but who cares? You
Yeah.
know, like the Friday night at Applebee's is not that important anyway.
Yes, definitely. In my conversations with my husband, when we're sorting out like what that number would look like for us, it's like, okay, so like we could rent out the house, we could travel around the country in an RV, like we wouldn't be paying for flights, we wouldn't have our the rental income would cover our more. So like what's like living like the leanest lifestyle that would still align with our values, like what would that number be? And then also, like you said, in the different seasons of life, because what that number would look like now while we're homeschooling 3 children and I'm the full-time parent versus what that number will look like, because like our oldest is a teenager already, so like what that number will look like in the next season of life for us, like when we don't have 3 kids that we're supporting and I would have more flexibility in terms of how many hours I would be willing to work. So I love that you brought those 2 points to it. And the FIRE, just so everyone knows, like the acronym, financial independence, retire early. Though that retire early part, I know I've heard like hotly contested about what that means and what that looks like. And there seems to be some drama around, like, are you really retired if you're still doing meaningful work that contributes to society and happens to generate income?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So let's kind of tease out those 2 terms. So financial independence specifically is generating enough passive income, or at least enough potential passive income through your investments that you have enough. You could live on that if you wanted to or needed to. So that's the FI of FIRE, financial independence. And then the RE of the word FIRE, retire early, that's the controversial part. And honestly, if I could wave a magic wand and just make the retire early component of it disappear, I would, because I think that's the part that on one hand, in terms of like marketing the concept, there are many people who come into the world of financial independence because they're drawn by the notion of retiring.
Yep.
And that idea is so attractive that that's what brings them initially into the movement. And then once they come into the movement, they discover the nuances. But then there are other people who hear the word retirement and they have this knee-jerk reaction of, why would I want to retire at the age of 30 or 35 or 40 or 45? And so they're immediately turned off from it. So I think the word retire is a very polarizing term.
It is.
And so for that reason, I would make it go away, because it's really not about retiring. I think that's I honestly think that that's poor branding on the movement. But
It's
nothing I
just
can
such a
do about
marketable acronym.
it is. FIRE is definitely a lot more marketable than FI.
Totally. Absolutely. And as I learned more about financial independence, I felt a profound symmetry with the evolution we moved through with our children's education. Financial independence equals freedom in the same way that unschooling equals freedom. Through the deschooling process, we started asking, if our kids didn't have to be in a classroom all day for their entire childhoods, what could their lives look like? How would they learn? How would we live together? How could they discover how they fit into the world? How they could contribute? What are meaningful and fulfilling ways for them to spend their time? Financial independence helps us ask these same questions of the adults in the family. We all likely inherited this model of working a full-time job for 40 years in an office, but what if we didn't have to be in an office or on a job site all day for our entire adulthoods? What could our lives look like? How would we learn? How would we live together? How could we fit into the world and contribute? What are meaningful and fulfilling ways for us to spend our time? It's like, if you didn't have to work for grades, how would you learn? And if you didn't have to work for money, how would you live? Now, if you suddenly no longer had to work for money, there would surely be a de-working stage, just like there is a de-schooling stage. But after that passes, you get to the really juicy, conscious, self-exploring, and lifestyle designing that I just love. So that's the why. Now let's start getting into the how. Okay, so income and expenses are the two dials that we have to adjust. You want to widen the gap between them. So let's start with income. What advice do you have for turning up that income dial?
So turning up the income dial, there are, of course, two ways that you can do that. One is at your day job, and the other is through side hustles or entrepreneurship, um, self-employed entrepreneurship, right? Uh, the the approach that a person should take depends largely on a combination of interest and opportunity. So, for example, if you're an anesthesiologist and you can pick up a couple of extra shifts and get paid incredibly well for that, do that because you're gonna make more money doing that than you would selling candles on Etsy,
Right.
right? But on the other hand, if you, like me, are a entry-level newspaper reporter at a small town paper making $21,000 a year, um, it was clear to me that I was never going to make big money at my newspaper. I think the highest paid person at the newspaper that I worked at made around 60,000 a year. And that was the highest paid person there.
Yeah.
So it was just clear to me that I didn't have strong potential for growth at the newspaper that I was at. And so that was how I knew that I would have much better potential to grow my income by taking a more entrepreneurial freelance route. And I think there are a lot of people who are in that same boat. There are a lot of people out there who they just don't have a huge level of opportunity for advancement in their day job. But if they can start some type of a side hustle where they're making an extra $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month, that's 36,000 a year. That's a significant chunk of change.
Yeah. And you did that with, was it social media marketing for businesses?
Yeah. So what
Okay.
I did was I started off as a freelance writer. So I started off contributing articles to a variety of primarily online publications. And so what happened was after a few years of doing that, a lot of my clients ended up being small businesses, such as, CPA firms, real estate brokerages, financial advisory firms. They ended up being these small businesses of typically 10 people or less, startups in the financial technology space, Silicon Valley startups it's called the fintech space. You know, they ended up being a lot of small businesses of 10 or fewer people who they knew that they needed content on their website. They needed a blog, they needed social media content, but they're a small business. They don't have the time or the inclination to have a full-time person in-house to do it. And so I started off writing freelance articles for a lot of those clients, and then I quickly saw that those clients didn't just need somebody to write articles. They needed somebody to manage their entire content calendar. They needed someone to come in and create a calendar that says, all right, Monday we're publishing this, Wednesday we're publishing this, Friday we're publishing this. These are going to be the 3 articles on your blog this week. Here's how we're going to optimize it for search engines. Here's how we're going to, here's the schedule for pushing this out in a newsletter format to the people who subscribe. Here is our entire social media calendar. Here's what we're going to be posting on Twitter and Facebook. They needed a content manager for their small business. And so when I saw that opportunity, I then escalated from simply contributing articles to offering full-scale content management services. And that was truly how I ramped up my business from part-time to full-time and from making a little bit of money to making 6 figures.
Nice. And so like the lesson there is, like you were moving in this one direction in your career with writing and interfacing with these companies, and you saw this need or this like gap that these businesses were having. And so you recognized it and you grew your skill set and your offerings to better meet that need and fill in that space.
Yeah, exactly. I went where the opportunity was.
I love that. And I did something similar because I graduated from graduate school with a master's degree in family therapy, but I had these babies and I didn't want to leave them. And I saw my friends like going into agency work and doing private practice. And that wasn't exactly aligning with the values I had for my life and the kind of lifestyle that I wanted to live. I wanted a little bit more freedom. But I really like leaned into my clients and my people, and I saw what they needed and how could I meet those needs in a different and creative way, and in a way that aligned with the kind of life that I wanted to live. And I see a lot of really rad, awesome people doing something similar where they're not necessarily doing that mainstream, like, you go to college, you get a degree, you work in the office and they pay you the salary. Like, I really kind of want to shake people up to get like really creative, especially because at 2008, I feel like really taught us that like that's not the secure path really either.
Exactly.
There was this like notion, this fear that like entrepreneurial, making your living as an entrepreneur was not secure, but full-time employment is not secure either. So I just really want to shake people up and empower them to get really creative and bold in trying different income sources.
Absolutely. And what's great about entrepreneurship is that you have multiple streams of income. So when when I ran this content marketing company, I had so many clients that if one client dropped off, it was fine because, there would be other clients,
Yes.
And so rather than deriving all of my income from the financial health of one company,
Absolutely.
I had that diversification, right? So if one of the fintech startups that I was working for didn't get their next round of VC funding and had to make cuts, that's fine because they're only 1/10 of my total income.
Yes, I read this book, Unworking, years ago by Clark, and I'm completely forgetting his last name, but he described it as patchwork income, which is like taking that concept of diversification, which we hear a lot with investments, and applying it to his income. So he had all these different streams of income, and that made it more secure for him because like if one dropped off, he would still have these others. But he also felt like it made it more like interesting and doable and sustainable for him because he didn't have to be like 1000% in love with any one of those things that he was doing because there was some variety that was involved in it.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about expenses. Elizabeth Willard Thames, or Mrs. Frugalwoods, was on episode 30 of this podcast talking about intentional spending. And now I want to hear your perspective, Paula. How can we turn down that expense style?
So my motto, as you know, is that you can afford anything but not everything. And so I often encourage people to think, and if you're married, have a conversation with your spouse about like, what do you genuinely value? And distinguish that from what society says that you quote unquote should have. Because I think there's a lot of social pressure that people think, well, because I'm a certain age or because we are a family with kids, that means that we're supposed to have an SUV or we're supposed to live in the suburbs or we're supposed to not rent out our guest room on Airbnb, right? Because like there's this notion that that's how you're quote unquote supposed to live to demonstrate both to yourself and to the outside world that you've so-called made it.
I will tell you, Paula, that is basically what this entire podcast is about, but we do it with like parenting and with education. There's like this mainstream set of expectations that we inherit as parents, and we really as a movement are rejecting all of that and forging our own path with intention. And we do it with education for our children. And I love that you are bringing that thread now to our financial life, that we inherit this from the media and from the way we were raised and from our friends. And, it's all around us, these messages, these expectations about what it is to be a successful family. And that comes with a very hefty price tag here in America. So to be able to have that values compass. When your values compass is sharply attuned, you're able to go all in on the things that really matter and let go of all the things that don't. And like minimalism, I know not everybody resonates with that word, but that is a word that really is helpful in describing that concept to me. And I just want everyone to feel invited to question everything and to simplify, go all in on what really matters as a family and let go of all of those assumed things that you need that you really don't.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. I'm a Nepalese American immigrant. I was born in Kathmandu, Nepal, and came to the U.S. I was 2 months old when I came to the U.S. And I've watched my family as they've come over, like as my cousins have come over, and most of my cousins came over. The ones who have come to the U.S. have come later in life after they've already started families of their own. And being an immigrant and watching that experience, like it is common in my family for uh, for parents with young children to live with roommates in a small apartment where the parents have their bedroom, and they've got a roommate with another bedroom, and then their 6-year-old son sleeps on a mattress in the living room. And like that's what you do because you're new here and you're just getting started, right? Like that's exactly what my cousin Baruna did. And in my family, that's really normal because you're leaving Kathmandu for the first time. You're going to like Australia or New Zealand or the United States or Canada, wherever it is that you're moving. Like you're going there for the first time. You don't have money to throw around. Like you don't have money for your kid to have their own room, but they're perfectly fine. Like Asu was 6. He was fine with sleeping on a mattress in the living room. And in my family, that's normal. And so I think a lot of it is just what are you calibrated to? Like what expectations have you set? Like in my world, a successful family is a happy family. And a happy family is a family that like loves and supports one another. So if you have a family where you have toxic relationships and emotional abuse, then it doesn't matter if you have a nice house and a fancy car. You've got toxic relationships and emotional abuse, and that's going to be an unhappy family. And not that they're mutually exclusive, of course. I'm not trying to imply that at all. But let's separate consumerism from happiness.
Yes. And as families, we can bring in this piece of this psychological and this developmental and this scientific, like research-based, evidence-based component of what children actually need to thrive. And it's not lots of bedrooms and lots of toys. It's like time and connection and freedom and trust and experiences and all of these things. I just posted on Instagram the other day because I post a lot about, we do a lot of like nature adventuring and lots of community stuff with our friends and like 95% of it is free. Like all these pictures that everyone's liking and everyone's sharing and everyone's saying they're so jealous of, like you can just go outside and do it. Like really, that's how my kids thrive. Like we just go outside and I just let them be and I run with them and we jump in rivers and I mean, all that stuff is free.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about investing. The primary vehicle for getting to financial independence seems to be investing. So will you walk us through that? Like, let's talk low-fee index funds, tax-deferred accounts, compound interest.
Awesome. Okay. Walk through investing. It's a big question. So I guess I'll start by saying, imagine a series of cups and mugs, right? You've got a coffee mug, you've got a pint glass, you've got champagne flutes, you've got whiskey glasses, you've got wine glasses.
I'm holding a teacup.
You've got a teacup. Yeah, exactly. Right? So each of those are vessels. And so when we talk about different types of accounts, like your 401k or your 403b or an IRA, which is an individual retirement account, or an HSA, which is a health savings account. When we talk about those accounts are vessels, they're mugs. And I want to start by clarifying that when we talk about those accounts, we're talking only about the vessel that holds the investments, because there are a lot of people who say, oh, I don't want to contribute to a 401k because I don't trust the stock market. But the thing is, to put your money inside of a vessel, you don't have to invest it in the stock market if you don't want to. We can do that, and we can talk about that in a moment. But putting your account inside of a vessel gives it the tax advantage that is associated with that vessel. So putting money inside of a coffee mug or a pint glass or a teacup or a champagne flute gives it the tax advantage that's associated with that particular type of vessel, right? And so you start by deciding which vessel you want to put your money into, based on what type of tax advantage and what type of timeline to withdrawing that money you want, right?
Right.
And then once you choose the proper vessel, then the next step is to decide, all right, now that my money is inside this vessel, now that my money is inside this champagne flute, what am I going to do with it? And when you're making that decision, essentially that's the equivalent of deciding if you want to fill that champagne flute with orange juice or tequila or champagne or water or milk or all of those combined, which would be a very interesting drink. And there are kind of pros and cons to each of those different types of liquids, but you have the freedom to choose what type of liquid or what combination of liquids you put in that vessel. And so some examples of that would be equities, which is another word for stocks. And when you buy equities or stocks, then you're buying a share of companies. And so when you buy a share of companies, then you become a part owner of that company. So if you, for example, buy a fund that holds Coca-Cola and Nike and Tesla, then you are a part owner of each of those companies. And you can buy these funds that are called index funds, where an index fund doesn't try to pick and choose particular companies. They simply tag themselves to an index of whatever it is that index represents. So if you buy an index fund and that index is representing the total US stock market, then that means that you are buying a share of every company in the total US stock market, which means that index fund will perform as well or as poorly as the total overall US stock market, no better and no worse. And what that does is that it gives you freedom from having to pick winners and losers. And statistically speaking, you are more likely to do better tagging yourself to the overall broad market, buying that index fund, than you are playing a guessing game of who you think the winners and losers might be.
Yes. Index funds are like playing the average. And the book, A Simple Path to Wealth, was like hugely helpful for me in understanding all of that.
Yes, absolutely. A huge fan of that book. J.L. Collins, who's the author of that book, is a good friend of mine. And the point that he makes in that book is that you, statistically speaking, are unlikely to do better than the overall market. So don't try. The simplest path is also the path in which you're most likely to succeed. Just buy the total U.S. stock market as an index fund, because as an index fund, it's going to have low fees, and buy as much of it as you can and hold on to it for as long as you can.
Yes. So you pick like a tax deferred bucket, pour your money into it, have that bucket play the averages in a low fee index fund. So you're not getting a lot of fees and you're just playing the average, and leave it be, let it sit for a period of time. And that's where you really start getting the compound interest to work for you. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. So let's say that you invest $100 this year. And at the end of this year, that 100 has grown to 110. At the beginning of next year, you, assuming no new contributions, you now have $110 invested, 100 of which is what's called your principal. That's the initial amount of money that you contributed. And the other 10 of which is your gain or growth on that principal. So now let's assume that you don't make any new contributions. You go to the end of year 2. And that 110 has grown to 121. It's grown another 10%, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you have earned money not just on the initial 100 that you contributed, but you've also earned a return on that $10 in growth. So in year 1, with a 10% return, your 100 turned into 110. But in year 2, with that same 10% return, your 110 grew into 121. It grew $11 rather than 10 because that extra $10 also itself grew 10%, right?
Yes.
And so at the end, you might be thinking like, okay, well, great, I made $11 instead of 10, big deal. But add a few more zeros to this. And then it does become a big deal. And then instead of just waiting 2 years, add that to, turn that into 20 years, and then it becomes a very big deal.
Exactly. So some people, I've heard people say like, well, okay, so say the stock market returns is on average is returning like 8%. Well, if I put in $1,000, that's only this much money. But like over time, like if it's sitting in there for 20 years and you're adding $1,000 to it every month, like the compound interest really leverages the initial investment that you're able to make in a way that not many other things can.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Compound growth is a wonder of the universe.
Yeah.
And it works the other way around too. So let's say that you have credit card debt, right? So in year 1 of having that credit card debt, you are paying interest only on the charges that you've made. But in year 2, you're paying interest on like it compounds on itself, right? You're paying interest on the unpaid interest.
Yes.
And
oh my God, yes. So my husband and I just recently finally paid off 6 figures of student loan debt between the two of us and both of our master's degrees. Thank you. $106,000. But it's funny because when we first graduated from graduate school, we spent like the next 10 years or however long it was paying like $500 a month, and the balance grew.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Again, the power of compound interest.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'll walk everyone through kind of our investment buckets or vessels, as you say, that we pour into, just so we have like an example. We have a 401k through my husband's employer that we have invested in VTR, or the Vanguard Target Retirement. So if you have like full-time employment, oftentimes they just give you a small list to choose from, and they usually have some sort of target retirement package, which is like a mix of stocks and bonds that recalculates based on what year you're retiring and what year you're in right now. And the government says that the contribution max, or the most we can contribute to a 401k this year, is $19,000. So we have set up the monthly contribution so that it will total that at the end of the year. And a 401k is one of those tax-deferred retirement accounts. So the money we drop in there is pre-tax dollars. So we don't pay taxes on the money we put in there right now. And then my husband's company has a 4% half match. So when we contribute 4, they add 2 to that bucket. And yes, please, on an immediate 50% return rate. And I know a lot of employers have like 100% match to a certain percentage, which is free money. Then we have an IRA invested in VTSAX, which is Vanguard's low-fee index fund, to the contribution max of $6,000 for the year. And then once we got all those set up, we really started throwing all of our extra money at paying off our house. So that's something that we're working on right now. But then after that, like I know there are a lot of financial independence folks out there who really wedge out that gap and are able to have an even higher savings rate. And so they do things like the HSA, the health savings account, an ESA, an educational savings account. They invest in rental properties, which I know something like you said was one of the pieces of the pie for you. So then they start looking for other buckets to put that money in to make it grow, and even non-tax deferred investment accounts, right?
Yes, absolutely. The benefit of non-tax advantaged accounts is flexibility. If you think of a tax advantaged account like a retirement account, the reason that you're getting that tax advantage is that you and the government are making a deal where the government says, I will give you a tax break on the condition that you don't tap this money until you're at least 59 and a half.
Yeah.
So if there's money that you want to tap before you're 59 and a half, then just don't take that deal.
Yes. Yes, go with the non-tax deferred option, and then it gives you a little bit more freedom. Of course, you then don't have that like money that you're not getting taxed on, but you can take out that money whenever you want.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about some of the pitfalls. What are some cautionary tales you have seen, and how can we avoid some of those pitfalls?
Ooh, so first of all, there's this notion called risk tolerance, which means how much, like if the market drops, let's imagine that it's 2008 all over again. Will you panic and sell? Because that is the worst thing that you could possibly do.
Yes.
That's when you turn paper losses into real losses. And so finding out self-knowledge is the ultimate investing hack, right? Figuring out what your own risk tolerance is and investing in a way that's appropriate to that. That's how you protect yourself from yourself. So
Brilliant.
People often hold a mix of stocks or equities, usually through index funds in the FIRE world. They'll hold a mix of equities and bonds. First of all, bonds and equities tend to move in inverse relation with one another, meaning that if one rises, the other falls. And so that smooths out the ride in your portfolio. In addition to that, bonds tend to be less volatile, meaning they don't have the wild swings that equities do, which means that you have a chunk of your portfolio that's more stable. So if it's 2008 all over again, then there's a section of your portfolio that's plummeting, but another section that's more stable.
Mm-hmm.
Or even rising as investors flee into the safety of bonds, right? And so the mix of stocks to bonds that you want to hold should be based on your timeline to withdrawal and your risk tolerance.
Mm-hmm. So don't invest any more or in any area that would result in you pulling your money out if things started to go down, right? Because that's like the worst possible thing that you can do. You want to put your money in there and you want to leave it through those dips, because there will be dips. Like this is a reality of the stock market. And it's also a reality of the stock market that it always comes back up. So to leave your money in during those dips, just ignore them and know that it will come back up. So don't invest more than you are comfortable leaving in for those ups and downs, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's a good one. Financial independence folks, I have seen, tend to be hyper focused on the numbers, which I can absolutely appreciate, but sometimes heart or psychology trumps math. For example, I know FIRE folks can be fairly anti-paying off the house when the average index fund returns 8% and the mortgage rate might be 5%. The numbers say to invest instead, but paying off the house is emotionally and psychologically meaningful for us, and it motivates us to widen that gap more than increasing our investment percentage does. And I know you talked about that recently when it was recommended that you refinance a mortgage, but you sat with it and opted to pay it off instead, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I just went through exactly this same question where I had a meeting with a financial advisor, and he recommended we took a look at a spreadsheet of all of my assets and liabilities, and it's because of the divorce, actually, because of the pending divorce, I need to refi some of my rental properties. Or theoretically need to refi some of my rental properties. So I chatted. He's a certified divorce financial analyst, so he specializes in like helping people go through divorces.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sat down, we took a look at it, and he was like, refinance these, save your cash, and then use your cash to make new investments.
Yeah.
Which mathematically is the most sensible thing to do. And so I had a phone call on a Friday afternoon with a mortgage broker. We talked, feel bad, I kind of wasted his time because we talked for like 2 hours. And at the end of that call, I had this terrible, terrible, terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite identify. And I spent the whole weekend just sitting with it. And by Monday morning, I realized I just don't want to refi these mortgages. I want to pay them off. I have the money to pay them off. Please let me just pay these off.
I love that because I do see that sometimes when we're so hyper focused on the numbers and on the math, which obviously that should be what informs our choices, but we also like that emotional piece is valid and that psychological piece is valid. And sometimes, I make choices where one choice might bring in a little bit more money or reduce our expenses a little bit, but on the other side of that choice, my life gets a little bit simpler or we get a little bit more joy added to it. So there's always that emotional psychological piece that should be weighed in the equation as well.
Absolutely. And one thing I often tell my audience, and you mentioned this as well, is choose the option that motivates you to save more than you otherwise would. Because at the end of the day, your contributions are the single biggest determinant of your success as an investor and as a manager of your financial life. And so the option that motivates you to save more than you otherwise would is going to be the winning choice.
Oh, yes. I could not agree more. My husband is like on fire about paying off the house. And then when we talk about like raising our investment rate, he's like, I get it intellectually, but something about being mortgage free is like freedom. Like this house that I work on all the time is mine and I won't have this monthly mortgage payment. And it's so meaningful to him that it motivates him to widen that gap between income and expenses. So in the end, I think the math will end up being that this choice would be more beneficial, even if the numbers don't necessarily say that on paper initially.
Exactly.
And along the journey of getting to financial independence, some people can dive down into some dark states of martyrdom. And I'm not advocating for that at all, especially since in this community, we really value connection and joy and being present with our children. Could I work 3 jobs and put my kids in school and pull that financial independence date closer? Absolutely. Am I going to? No, I'm not. So what I'm advocating for is an awareness that there is this other path and a consciousness around how you make your money work for you.
Absolutely. I think the paradox of financial independence is that once you get there, you realize that you don't, people often view financial independence as a binary, like yes or no, you are or you're not. Like they think it's a light switch. It's not that at all. And once you reach financial independence, you realize that it's actually a spectrum. And there are different degrees of freedom. And as you walk along the path to financial independence, your life progressively becomes more and more and more free. And so reaching financial independence, again, defined as the point at which your potential passive income through investments is enough, that is simply 1 degree of change in what has already been a decade of positive changes that have incrementally grown your freedom along the way, right? Like you reach debt freedom, and that's a certain type of freedom. You reach the freedom that comes from maybe not full financial independence, but that you have enough passive income that your investments could generate $1,000 a month. And that provides a component of psychological relief where you think, okay, if there's a job layoff, if there's another 2008, then we at least have this, right?
Yes. I'm so glad I'm having this conversation with you because that is such a brilliant perspective and I'd never really thought about it that way before, but it absolutely, we get so fixated on like, this is the date or this is the finish line, but all those steps along the way are increasing degrees of freedom and peace of mind. Like paying off the student loan was immense for us, but also when we fully funded our emergency fund and when we funded the kids' college accounts and when their launching funds and when, all of these steps along the way, when we bumped up our retirement investments to hit that 15% threshold, all of these steps along the way do increase our sense of freedom and peace of mind.
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay, let's move into our Q&A. So I posted in the Sage Parenting Facebook tribe and in Patreon that we're going to chat about financial independence today and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Sierra wants to know how to feel confidently prepared for black swan events when those large unexpected expenses are multiplied in a large family. Quote, "We just want to be able to be there for our children long term, not only physically and mentally, but also financially."
So how to prepare for black swan events. So first, for the benefit of everybody who's listening to this who might not be familiar with that term, a black swan event is an unexpected catastrophic event. So for example, if somebody gets hit by a bus, if somebody gets a severe diagnosis, those types of events. If a tree falls on your house and your insurance company denies the claim.
Yeah, my mother
Right.
recently passed away from cancer, and we spent 2 months living in the hospital with her, like black swan event. Like we had to have the ability to make that work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in order to financially prepare for a black swan event, this quote comes from J.L. Collins, the author of A Simple Path to Wealth, and I
Love
think
him.
I do too. It's brilliant. He says, "Flexibility is the only true security." In the financial independence community, it is common and tempting to try to over prepare for black swan events by, making financial contingency plan on top of financial contingency plan.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who think, well, they suffer from what I refer to as just one more year syndrome,
Oh,
where they think,
yes.
I'll work for just one more year, or I'll save up, I'll build my investment portfolio by just an extra 100,000 or an extra 200,000, right? Thinking that will solve all of their problems, or that will provide the buffer. Now, I'm not saying don't have a margin of error. Margin of errors are great, but at the end of the day, flexibility is the only true security. And so I think that the ultimate preparation for black swan events is knowing that should that need arise, you have the willingness, the fortitude, the gumption to do whatever it is you've got to do to make it work.
Yes. Yes. I love that perspective on that question. I could not agree with you more. I hear it in my work. I get it a lot in terms of, because we're homeschoolers. So in terms of like, what if we haven't taught them everything that they could ever possibly have a need to know? Like, so then you have to focus on teaching them how to learn and not what to learn, so that as those needs do arise, and they're going to be unexpected, and you're not going to know what it is that they are going to need to know, because the world is going to be different in 10 years than it is now. So to trust that and to focus on giving them the skills and, like you said, the gumption and the drive and the fortitude and all that to be able to get those answers and to meet their needs when they get there. And this, now we're just applying that same thing again to finances, to know that we can't possibly prepare for every possible black swan event or every possible hiccup in life, but hiccups will come. And so instead focus on having the flexibility and the drive and the fortitude and the skill set and the psychological ability, to sort of bend with the wind and be pliable to be able to meet those needs as they arise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you make a good point in terms of, like, if you think about technology right now and the landscape that we're living in. 10 years ago, none of us could have predicted that the technology that we are handling today, we couldn't have prepared for this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? But we have, most of us have the ability to learn new technologies as they arise. And the ability to figure it out is what gets us through.
Yes.
And so same with black swan events, and more broadly than black swan events, same with the management of your financial life. When you have confidence in knowing that you can you can figure out how to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Lovely.
Then, yeah, that's how you master that.
So we're not going to hop on the Susie Orman train of you need $10 million in order to be financially independent. If you haven't listened to Paula Pant's interview with her on her Afford Anything podcast, it's a real hoot.
That was my most popular and most controversial episode. So yes, go to your favorite podcast player and look up Afford Anything, Susie Orman.
And know that I disagree with all of it.
And then if you really want to laugh, then also listen to the follow-up episode that we did right after that.
So I actually started the Susie Orman episode, and then I stopped it. I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. And then I listened to the one after first so that like my nerves could calm down a bit, and then went back and listened to the original one.
I've heard a lot of people say that. I've heard a lot of people say like, they were like, I couldn't make it through the whole thing. Or people were like, that was really hard to listen to.
Yes. So hard to listen to, but fun. Okay, so let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sageparenting.com/podcast35, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So Paula, what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic of financial independence? And of course, the first link is going to be to the Afford Anything podcast, where people can go and listen to more from you.
Yes, absolutely. The Afford Anything podcast. I would recommend any of our more recent episodes. So in the beginning, we had less of a focus on financial independence. I would say anything from episode 100 on has more of an emphasis on financial independence. Everything that we've talked about today, managing your money, investing, growing. So I would start there. I also have a blog that I've been writing since 2011 called affordanything.com, where you can read through the archives and learn all about a lot of the topics that we've talked about today. I have a lot of stuff on there about investing for beginners that people find very helpful. And I have a free ebook that you can download for free, affordanything.com/escape, which is all about escaping the 9-to-5.
Oh, I'm on your list, but is that where you had, through that, I got the, what was it? A tweak a week? Maybe I just signed up directly for that.
Yeah, you signed up directly for that.
I loved that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so also people sign up for a tweak a week. I think maybe I heard you mention it on your podcast and I signed up through that link, or maybe I got to the link somewhere else. But it was this email sequence where she just gave these really simple, like, one thing to do each week of 2019, and it was so simple and very helpful. So excellent job on that, Paula.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm also going to include a link to my financial book list blog post, which has just some of the financial books that have been most helpful to me. But definitely everybody should be listening to your podcast and checking out your website. Paula, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing this conversation with me. You are so much fun in like pseudo real life.
Thank you. You are too. I've had a great time. And they all lived happily ever after.
Oh, perfect. Perfect ending. You nailed it.